if-else statements in general allow us to check against a conditional statement to decide whether or not to execute a line of code. And when you hear that term conditional statement, you should be thinking about Booleans, some sort of check if something is true or false. And then if the condition is true, we execute some code. If it's false, then we don't execute the code. For example, if somebody's logging into a Flutter application, we will check to make sure that their username matches our stored username. And if that condition happens to be true, then we'll go ahead and log them in. Else, we do something else, like say, sorry, that username isn't recognized. Now, Dart uses parentheses and curly braces to format the if, else if, and else in the control flow. So here's a screenshot example from the documentation. You can see here they're actually calling functions and methods off of objects. So there's checking if it is raining, then you are going to bring a raincoat. Here's the interesting idea though. You can actually stack else if statements as well to check for other conditions if it's not raining. Else, if it's snowing, then you wear a jacket. Else, you'll go ahead and put the top down on your car. Let me break it down a little further than this kind of silly example. So we're first going to cover the if-else statement. So we'll say if some condition is true, then we're going to execute that line of code inside the curly braces for the if statement, only if that condition is true. So again, if this purple condition happens to be true, then any code here in between these curly braces associated with the condition inside the parentheses ends up executing. Else, we'll go ahead and execute if that condition happens to be false. So for example, here we can say if username equals the stored username. Then we execute some code that says print welcome to the application. Else, in that case, we know this condition is false. That means the username didn't match the stored username. So we say else sorry. We can print some code here that says sorry, your username isn't found, etc. Now, what happens if you actually want to check against multiple conditions in case this if condition is not true, but you also want to check against other conditions? For example, in the previous example, we saw that they also checked if it was not just raining, but snowing. So that's where the else if comes into play, and you can stack as many else ifs as you want. So the thing to keep in mind though, is you're now starting to check against certain conditions, and only one of these blocks of code is going to execute. So you're going to say if condition 1 is true, then you execute whatever is inside these curly braces. So you check against that one condition. Keep in mind, nothing else is going to be checked after that if condition 1 ends up being true. If condition 1 is false, then we go down to the second condition and we check if that one's true. So we'll say else if this one's true, then we'll execute this block of code. If condition 2 ends up being true, then that stops everything. So something to keep in mind is if you stack a bunch of else if statements and many of those conditions are actually true, only the first condition that is true ends up being executed. After that, you're done with the if-else statement. So again, keep in mind that if you have multiple true conditions in the stack, only the first true one ends up getting executed. And then, just like before, at the very end, you'll have some else. So if the rest of these conditions on top of it end up being false, then we execute some other line of code. All right, let's actually code this out in Dartpad. I'll see you there. Inside Dartpad, let's start off by creating a few variables. I'm going to have, let's say, a username or just a name, and let's have it be Greg. And then I'm going to create, let's say, a wrong name. So we'll say the wrong name, and I'll just make it really obvious. I'm going to say this is wrong. And let's say the next one, I'm going to say stored name is equal to Greg. So let's imagine I have a very simple application and I have a name that I'm going to try to log in with, Greg. I have a wrong name. Let's say someone's trying to hack their account, but they don't know the name. And then I have my internal stored name. Again, very simple example. This is really just for illustrative purposes. Now, how can I check to make sure that the name matches the stored name? We already know that I can perform something like this. Print, does name match the stored name? So that was known as a condition. I'm doing a comparison operation here, and this should print out true because Greg does in fact match Greg, the stored name. Now, if I want to execute code when this particular condition happens to be true, that's where I can use an if statement. So let's try it out. The syntax is if, and then in parentheses, you type out the condition you want to check. So in this case, I want to check to make sure that the name that's being supplied, Greg, matches the stored name inside my little application here. And then inside curly braces, this is the code that I want to execute if this condition happens to be true. So I can say, for example, name matched stored name. And notice I can keep adding more blocks of code here. We don't know too much code here to do anything kind of beyond the print statement yet, but you kind of get the idea. I could keep saying, welcome to the app, etc. And then here I could make calls to log people in, maybe check a phone number, etc. So there's a bunch of stuff here. The main idea is that all of this goes in between these two curly braces attached to this particular condition check, which is attached to this if call. So it's if, in parentheses, you check the condition, and then here in curly braces, whatever block of code you want. And you can check if something's associated with this if by simply collapsing or expanding. So again, this is very useful to kind of navigate your code. Let's go ahead and run this and see what we expect to have happen. So we're going to say if name is equal to stored name, then the name matches the stored name, and then welcome to the application. So we do see in the output that the name matches the stored name, and then welcome to the application. What happens if we provide the wrong name? So let's say someone tries logging in with the wrong name. So wrong does not match Greg. If we run this now with the if statement check, you actually don't end up seeing an output. So let's expand on the simple if statement by having an else. So often, if something's not true, you want something else to occur. You don't just want, no action to be taken. But you can see that in certain cases where you just want to do a quick check, the if statement can live by itself on its own. But often you will see it associated with an else. So if this isn't true, do something else. And notice else has no conditional check because you're only running else when the condition above ends up being false. So here, I know that if this else block of code ends up being run, then I didn't have an actual match up here. So in that case, I can print out, name provided did not match stored name. And then make sure we put a semicolon there. And then I can run this. Let's go ahead and check that out. And then we get name provided did not match stored name. And often what you'll see is people tend to do these sort of comparison checks and actually assign those to variables as well. So you could do something like this. Variable match is equal to, and then you could grab this comparison, cut it out, and then paste that here. And then you can say if match, do the following. So if you run that, you'll actually end up seeing the same result. Name provided did not match stored name. Let's actually check this to be true. Let's say if we say, the variable match is equal to this comparison, name is equal to stored name. You run that, and then you'll see that name match stored name, welcome to app. Sometimes it's a little easier to read code if there's variables here. It's really up to you what you prefer, if you like using variables or if you like doing the comparison within the condition. So for the sake of clarity, I'm going to keep using the actual comparison inside of this code. So we won't use a variable here, but I do want you to be aware that that is an option for you. So we'll say if the name is equal to the stored name, then name is matched. Okay, so now let's go ahead and expand on this. What if there's another condition I want to check? Maybe Greg is accidentally misspelling their name, and I'm going to try to make this kind of a more complicated condition to check. Let's imagine I want to do a quick check to see whether or not it's misspelled, and we'll try to give a hint, hey, by the way, maybe it's misspelled. So I'm going to check, does the last letter of the name supplied match the last letter of stored name? So let's first think about it. How do I grab the last letter of stored name? Well, I can say stored name, and let's put this in a print statement as we explore it. I'm going to comment this block of code out. Remember, that's just control /. So I'm going to print the last letter of stored name. How can I do that? Well, as you explore more about Dart, you'll realize that with strings, you can actually index those as well. So for example, I can say stored name, and I can grab the very first item in this index by saying at index 0. Now that's the first letter, so I would expect this to end up being a capital G. Let's go ahead and run that and check. We should print out a capital G, and there it is. But remember, I said I wanted the very last letter. And we've actually already encountered this problem before, but with lists, what we can do is we can recall that the stored name has a length to it. However, if I were to just run this, I'd actually get an error. It would be outside of the length of stored name because indexing starts at 0. So for example, you'll see right now that, hey, it's out of the range of that. And it says index should be less than 4, which kind of makes sense because you're going 0, 1, 2, 3. And so right now we're providing it with 4, which means I have to subtract 1 because indexing starts at 0. So now when you run this, we have a method of actually grabbing the last letter. Again, you're indexing based off the length minus 1, which gives you the index position of the very last letter, and then you can grab that from either stored name or any of these names. So I can also do the same for the name. So I can say name here, and you'll notice the same result. So this is going to give us the last letter. Go ahead and run that, and you actually won't see a difference. It's still a lowercase g on all of these, but you get the idea. Okay, so that's a quick aside on how to grab the last letter. So this is the last letter of a variable, of a string variable, I should say. I'll go ahead and comment that out, and let's uncomment this. So let's imagine that I want to check, does the name match the stored name? If so, go ahead and print, hey, the name matched stored name, welcome to the app. Else, I can print name provided did not match stored name. But what if I want to check the condition, hey, is the last letter matching a lowercase g, to make sure maybe Greg is just misspelling their name or something. In that case, I can type in else if, set another conditional check, and then set some curly braces here to check against. So what I'm doing is I check, hey, if this condition is true, execute this block of code. Else if, and this is where I can start checking against other conditions. So in fact, let's check if the name, or if the last letter of this name is equal to the letter G. And if so, I'm going to print out wrong name, but close, last letter is G. And that confirms it. And then we can say else, print name provided did not match the stored name. So we've got to make sure we put a semicolon there, make sure everything is running, and let's make sure we don't have any issues here. Wrong name isn't used, that's okay. That's just for the sake of this example. Let's go ahead and execute this and think about what it's going to print. Okay, so if I provide name, Greg does match the stored name. Okay, so that makes sense. Now let's try the following. Let's swap out the name with the wrong name. So I'm checking if wrong name is equal to stored name, print this out. And then I'm going to swap in here if the last letter of wrong name is equal to G, go ahead and test that out. Otherwise, print name not provided. Now what do we expect to actually happen? Do I expect the first block of code to run, the second block of code to run, or the third block? Well, let's go ahead and run this and kind of explore. The first block only executes when these two strings match. So wrong does not match Greg, so we know that's not going to be the case. Then the second block of code is going to execute only if the last letters match, if there's a last letter matching G. So it says now wrong name, but close, the last letter is G. So this block of code did execute. Else, notice it didn't get executed. So the thing to keep in mind here is only when it's true, then that ends the statement, and that's what's going to print out. Okay, that's the very basics of an if, and else statement. To make it very clear, I'm going to delete all this and kind of build the most basic example possible, just using true and falses to really drive home the point of the fact that certain blocks get executed and certain ones don't if it's true or false. So I'm going to say if true, print first block. And then I'm going to say else if, let's put another condition, and for now let's put it false, print, and then we'll say second block. And whoops, gotta make sure I put my semicolons there. And then finally I'll say else. And notice else never takes a condition because it only executes if everything else above it happened to be false. Then I'm gonna print last block. So these are my 3 blocks of code. And notice I could keep stacking else ifs. So I can have another else if, checking for another statement. Let's make this one also false. I put in my set of curly braces there, and then I'm going to say print third block, semicolon. Okay, so that should clean everything up. Let's go ahead and run this and make sure it's actually working. So again, I'm saying if this is true, print the first block. Else if, and then I'm on purpose providing these as false. So first block executes, which makes sense. And notice none of these other ones execute. But what would happen if I actually make this first one false and the second one true? It's kind of, obvious, but we would expect it to say, well, print the second block. Okay, that makes sense. But what I really want to show you is what happens if another else if statement is true. Sometimes beginners get confused and they think both second block and third block will execute because both the conditions are true. What I really want to get across right now is only the first condition that is true ends up being executed. Everything else below it does not get executed. So this one's false, it doesn't get executed, and now when I run this, I should only expect to see second block. Notice that even though the third block condition was true, it did not get executed. So in if-else statements, you're only looking for the first true condition, you run that block, and then nothing else below it ends up getting run, which kind of makes sense now given the language they chose. If this is true, do this. Else, if this is true, do this. Until the very end, else, if none of the above was true, print the last block. Okay, that's it for if-else statements. Coming up next will be a simple exercise. We'll see you there.